In a world where silence is often regarded as a shield, was the death of Yu Menglong the final chess piece to be discarded from the board of power? When a life suddenly becomes a terrifying void, we are forced to ask ourselves, was that brilliant aura true glory? Or was it a tomb built with slave contracts and belated empathy? Every bit of your attention at this moment is a refusal to forget. A like or a subscription is not just support for the channel, but a way for us to together light a spark amidst the dense night of information. Please leave your thoughts below, as your voice is the missing piece needed to complete the picture of justice for Yu Menglong. 100 days have passed since Yu Menglong departed from this world. 100 days, in terms of time, is not an excessively long period in the history of a vast society. Yet, for those still trying to understand what happened, it is a prolonged, heavy, and haunting silence. Death in itself is not what humans find difficult to accept, as no one can exist forever. What prevents the public from finding peace is the fact that a life, which once existed vividly before the public eye, vanished into a fog of ambiguous information with too many unanswered questions. There are those who admit they once lived in a state of indifference, as if walking through their own long sleep. It was only when this event occurred that they felt awakened, forced to open their eyes and look directly at what has always existed but was often ignored. The world seems unchanged. The rhythm of life continues, but behind that familiar surface are dark voids that make it impossible for people to remain as indifferent as before. When a story remains unclarified, silence is no longer neutral. It gradually becomes a psychological burden for the entire society. In recent days, an image with powerful symbolic meaning has circulated in cyberspace. It is the image of countless hands supporting a tiny creature, together pushing it forward. Someone once sarcastically remarked that even if hundreds of millions of tiny individuals joined together, they could not create any significant shift. However, that very image poses a different question. Is the value of an individual truly measured by lone strength, or by the ability to raise a collective voice when facing injustice? Throughout the past 100 days, the public reaction has passed through many different states. From shock, grief, and bewilderment to suspicion, and then gradually shifting toward a demand for the truth. It has not been an easy journey. On that path, there has been fear, a sense of helplessness, and even moments of self-doubt. However, it is noteworthy that there are still those who choose to keep moving forward, not because they believe they can change everything, but because they refuse to accept an ending that lacks transparency. Behind the concern for Yu Menglong lies a deeper anxiety. When such a story occurs, people do not only wonder what happened to a celebrity, they also question their own tomorrow. If today a story can be closed with information that is insufficient to be convincing, then what will happen when a similar situation befalls ordinary people who have no spotlight and no public attention? Precisely from this point, the story no longer stops at an individual. It becomes a mirror reflecting society's silent anxieties regarding transparency, accountability, and the fragile boundary between power and truth. And that is also the reason why, despite the passage of time, the questions surrounding this case have not subsided in the least. Before becoming the center of a widespread public debate, Yu Menglong was known as a relatively private face in the Chinese language entertainment industry. His career path did not bear the hallmarks of a loud star or one who frequently appeared in controversies. On the contrary, the image the public was familiar with was that of an actor who worked steadily, made few attention-grabbing statements, and rarely took the initiative to place himself at the center of the media. That very quietness, in an environment accustomed to fierce competition and unnameable unspoken rules, became the factor that led many to look back at the context surrounding his story. The mainland entertainment industry has long been more than just a space for artistic creation. It is a complex ecosystem where power relationships, economic interests, and public images are tightly intertwined. For those operating within this system, pressure comes not only from the audience or box office revenue, but also from invisible expectations and boundaries that are unwritten yet ever present. In this context, silence is sometimes seen as a safe strategy, but at other times it becomes a source of prolonged internal tension. According to information recalled in later discussions, Yu Menglong once entered a phase of his career marked by many changes. After becoming more widely recognized through television projects, he faced choices that were by no means simple. On the surface, it might have just been a matter of roles, contracts, or image orientation. However, behind those decisions was an environment where the line between individual freedom and systemic compliance was not always clear. It was at this intersection that many questions about motives and pressures began to arise in the minds of the public. When the incident occurred, the initial information released quickly closed the case with a brief conclusion. Formally, it was a familiar process. But for many observers, that presentation revealed notable gaps. Basic questions regarding the circumstances, developments, and the chain of related evidence were not clarified in detail. This does not automatically mean that wrongdoing existed, but in a society accustomed to strict information control, the absence of transparency immediately became a catalyst for suspicion. The public began to turn back the clock, searching for prior signs in the statements, images, and works that Yu Menglong had left behind. Certain details, which previously did not attract much attention, were now placed in a completely different context. It is worth noting that this process did not just reflect a desire to find the truth about an individual. It showed a collective psychology attempting to piece together fragmented information to fill an unfinished story. At a deeper level, Yu Menglong's story touches upon a core issue: what motives truly govern the behavior and choices of those operating within a closed system? Public motives can be presented using familiar concepts like career, fame, or contractual obligations. But alongside those, there always exist hidden motives, difficult to define and even harder to prove, including psychological pressure, the fear of isolation, or the feeling of losing control over one's own life. This is not just a story about a personal incident. It is the product of a complex operational structure where power and information are not distributed equally. When an event occurs in such a context, it is almost impossible for social reaction to stop at merely accepting an official announcement. The need to ask questions becomes a natural reflex, especially for those who have witnessed similar cases in the past. It must also be emphasized that public skepticism does not necessarily stem from a desire to deny all published information. Instead, it reflects a collective psychological state where trust has been eroded over time. In those circumstances, every information gap is easily interpreted in many different directions, and every unexplained detail becomes fertile ground for widespread speculation. At this stage of the story, the importance lies not in concluding what happened, but in identifying the context that allowed a personal matter to quickly transcend the scope of private life. Yu Menglong, whether present or no longer present, became a convergence point for the anxieties, doubts, and feelings of insecurity already existing within society. It was from that foundation that the wave of reaction in the following days could erupt with such powerful intensity. And that was also when the story began to enter another phase, where there was not only an analysis of context and motives, but also the emergence of a media flood with a speed and scale far exceeding initial predictions. When the information gaps had yet to be filled, the story of Yu Menglong quickly stepped beyond the scope of a single event and became the center of a media flood. Within a few days, the cyberspace moved with a frantic pace, where every new piece of information, no matter how small, had the potential to stir collective emotions. Platforms once familiar with entertainment discussions were now flooded with serious questions, reflecting a notable shift in public psychology. The initial reaction bore the heavy marks of sharing and grief. People talked about a human being, about the remaining images, and about an indefinable sense of loss. However, very soon after, that stream of emotion blended with suspicion. When official information was announced without accompanying details sufficient to answer basic inquiries, the public began to self-organize a process of seeking their own answers. That was the moment when social media no longer merely played a reflective role, but became a space for restructuring the narrative. Symbolic actions appeared with increasing frequency. From online memorial campaigns and calls for signatures to the display of images and messages related to the case in overseas public spaces, it is noteworthy that the scope of these activities was not limited by national borders. Interest spread to many different communities, including those who previously had no direct connection to the Chinese entertainment industry. This shows that the story had transcended its original framework, touching upon more universal concerns regarding justice and transparency. At the same time, the polarization of public opinion became distinct. One segment of the public chose to trust the announced information, arguing that continuing to dig deeper only increased unnecessary tension and speculation. For them, social order is maintained through the acceptance of official conclusions, even if not every detail is made public. Conversely, another group argued that it was precisely the absence of full information that caused suspicion to spread. For them, asking questions did not equate to denial, but was the minimum requirement to protect public trust. These two streams of perspective coexisted, sometimes clashing directly in prolonged debates. Those exchanges did not only revolve around the incident of Yu Menglong, but also expanded to how society reacts to authoritative announcements. Social media, in that context, was both a tool for connection and a space for magnifying conflict. Every post, every video clip, and every comment could be interpreted in many different ways, depending on the position and experience of the recipient. Another factor contributing to the increased intensity of the media flood was the participation of influential individuals. When people who were not directly involved in the incident spoke up, the story was placed into a broader frame of reference. Some approached the issue from the perspective of social ethics, while others analyzed it as a quintessential example of a media crisis within an information-controlled environment. Despite differing views, the commonality was that this event had become a catalyst for a discussion far exceeding the scope of entertainment. During that process, the impact of the media flood did not stop at public opinion. It also affected how the public perceived the entire cultural and entertainment ecosystem. Questions about power, about the safety of individuals within the system, and about the boundary between private life and collective interest were recalled with increasing frequency. This concern reflects a social state where trust is no longer a given, but needs to be reinforced by clear and consistent information. Amidst that divided context, emotions strongly governed how people received information. There were moments when outrage overwhelmed reason, causing unverified hypotheses to spread rapidly. Simultaneously, there were efforts calling for restraint, emphasizing the importance of distinguishing between facts and speculation. This tug-of-war created a tense atmosphere where each side believed they were protecting a core value, even if those values were understood in different ways. It was during this phase that the story posed a question that is not easy to answer. When information is incomplete, who bears the responsibility for seeking the truth, and where is the limit of skepticism? This is no longer a matter private to an individual or a single case, but a collective challenge for society in the digital media era, where the speed of dissemination often far outpaces the ability to verify. Faced with increasingly distinct polarization, many began to question their own position within that flow. Some chose silence, some continued to speak out, and some changed their views upon accessing new information. The diversity in reaction shows that the media flood was not just a surface phenomenon, but an expression of deep-seated contradictions in how society handles issues related to power and trust. Given that situation, a question is posed to all who are following. When information is missing and the story has no end, where will each person stand in the search for the truth? What do you think about this? If you believe that asking questions is necessary so that unfinished stories do not sink into oblivion, please leave a comment saying amen as a way to continue this dialogue. And it was from that division, debate, and doubt that the story gradually moved toward its darkest phase, where unanswered suspicions no longer just caused concern, but began to profoundly impact society's perception of its own future and safety. When the wave of discussion had spread and perspectives had become clearly revealed, the story of Yu Menglong entered its darkest stage. This was the time when the absence of information no longer just caused debate, but began to directly affect society's sense of safety. Unanswered questions accumulated over time, creating a state of prolonged tension where trust became more fragile than ever. At this stage, public's opinion no longer focused on individual details, but turned its attention to the overall picture. Signs previously considered fragmented were placed side by side, not to assert a specific scenario, but to point out the information gaps that still existed. Those gaps, although they could not yet be filled with verified data, carried great psychological weight. They caused the public to question not only what had happened, but also how similar events might be handled in the future. A sense of helplessness appeared clearly in many exchanges. There were those who admitted they did not expect new information to arrive soon, yet they still could not accept silence as a final conclusion. In that context, skepticism was no longer antagonistic but gradually shifted into a form of mental self-defense. When full access to the truth is impossible, people seek to protect themselves by asking questions, even when knowing those questions might not be answered. The peak of this phase lay in the story transcending the scope of a specific case to become a mirror reflecting collective fears. Many began to compare Yu Menglong's case with other past events where official announcements were made quickly but were not accompanied by a detailed explanatory process. The repetition of this pattern, even in different contexts, caused the feeling of insecurity to gradually become a familiar state. When the abnormal becomes familiar, society faces the risk of accepting it as an inevitable part of life. However, exactly at that dark point, a subtle transformation began to take shape. Instead of only revolving around suspicions regarding an individual, the discussion gradually shifted toward the question of collective responsibility. If a story that has not been clarified can cause such a widespread effect, then what does that say about the relationship between citizens, media, and power? This question did not aim to find a specific object to blame, but to clarify the role of each component in maintaining social trust. The moment regarded as enlightenment did not come from a new piece of information or a decisive piece of evidence. It came from the realization that regardless of the outcome of the case, its impact had far exceeded its original scope. Yu Menglong was no longer mentioned only as an actor or a central figure of controversy. He became a symbol for the anxiety over the fragility of the individual before larger structures, where an individual's voice is easily drowned out without public attention. From this perspective, many began to look back at their own roles. Not everyone has the ability to change the situation or create enough pressure to drive transparency. But the choice not to turn away, not to hurriedly forget, was seen as a form of silent participation. In a society where information can be limited, collective memory becomes another form of archive, one that is harder to control and harder to erase. That enlightenment brought with it an important realization. This story is not just about the past, it also poses questions for the future. If today a case can leave so many gaps like this, then what will ensure that similar stories in the future will be handled differently? That question has no simple answer, but the fact that it was raised showed a change in how society perceives the right to know and the right to ask. At the end of this phase, the dominant emotion was no longer outrage or bewilderment, but a sobriety mixed with caution. Public opinion seemed to realize that searching for the truth is a long-term process, requiring patience and a clear distinction between desires and facts. Instead of chasing every new hypothesis, many began to emphasize the importance of keeping the discussion from sliding into extremism so that the very need for transparency is not lost in the wave of emotion. It was from the intersection of darkness and that awakening that the story moved into another chapter. A chapter not aimed at closing the case, but at looking back at what had transpired, drawing lessons, and reflecting on its long-term meaning for society. And that is where the echo of Yu Menglong's story continues to resonate, not as a conclusion, but as an open question for everyone. When the darkness of contracts and silence surrounded the name Yu Menglong, what remained was not a final verdict, but a painful echo in the hearts of those left behind. He became an unintended symbol, a haunting reminder of the fragility of an individual when standing before the crushing gears of power structures. Is it possible that the truth does not disappear? It is merely retreating into the shadows to wait for a generation sober and persistent enough to light it up once more? The case of Yu Menglong is not just the story of a profession. It is a profound lesson in social trust. When transparency is replaced by vague information gaps, trust will be eroded by speculation and simmering insecurity. In an era where the boundary between facts and hypotheses becomes blurred, our responsibility is not just to observe, but to maintain our judgment against invisible forces. The future remains open, and perhaps the final pieces of the puzzle regarding Yu Menglong will forever remain in the dark. But the impact he left is irreversible. It forces us to look directly into the most sensitive corners of society. Asking questions in a sober manner is not an act of antagonism, but the highest expression of civic responsibility. The truth, even if it arrives belatedly, is always worthy of us never giving up the search. Do you choose silence for peace, or do you choose to walk with us to the end of the light? The journey to find justice sometimes begins with the refusal to forget. With just one subscription, or like, you have joined me in keeping this candle of truth from being extinguished amidst the storm of rumors. Please share your thoughts in the comment section, because our voice is the final barrier protecting the dignity of those who cannot yet speak.